Hey, welcome to the channel. My name is Christopher and I do non-emergency sales. Today we have a very special guest. It's a little bit of a funny story of how I tracked him down. Um, but before I get into that story, Brett, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Bob Weinstein. I'm primarily a commercial insurance agent and broker. I also happen to be an attorney, and my focus there is primarily business formation, business tax planning, and tax planning, generally speaking.
So I was on a non-emergency transportation Facebook group and I, I rarely read, I rarely go to it. It's one of those things, and something caught my eye. And basically, you had responded to a question regarding insurance. And you talked about the different parts of the country. It didn't matter what something does in one part of the country. It's no reflection in another part of the country. And I really was overwhelmed with how much knowledge you had on this area that, insurance is I don't know what it is. Is it depending on the company, it's half of what we do. I mean, it's we cannot operate without insurance. And so I get questions on insurance all the time. Why not have an expert talk about it? But furthermore, I found out that you actually have your own YouTube channel where you discuss not only insurance but other things. So yeah, go ahead and yeah, tell us about your YouTube channel. Tell us, about you.
Sure, thanks. In the YouTube, in fairness, the YouTube channel kind of came about because I started feeling a little bit hypocritical about being more of a coach than a player. I preach to especially new business owners in all shapes and forms of different businesses how important YouTube is. It's a great marketing tool. It costs essentially nothing. You don't need, a matter of fact, in some cases, it can be detrimental to attempt to get that Hollywood feel to it. Genuineness really sells well on YouTube. And just showing people how to do things resonates really well. If you're trying to create a commercial, maybe not. But if you can add value for others, your videos can do really well. So I do have, I did, to show that I could actually talk the talk, I created a few videos, and I'm about now to continue doing more in the very near future.
Did I see your first video? I don't even remember the number. It was like thousands of views. Like,
Yeah, and that was my very first one. I think it has, I'm pulling this off the top of my head, maybe 30,000 views.
that's incredible. That's incredible.
And that's strictly on the subject of NEMT. That's the video addresses only non-emergency medical transportation.
How did you get involved with NEMT insurance?
So I didn't set out to do that. What happened is most of my business is referrals. And so I wasn't advertising it. I wasn't promoting to try to go into that space. But transportation was a big part of what I do. And it started out with a referral from a client, now a client, that was frustrated. They were having problems obtaining coverage. Their usual suspects was to go to like their home and auto agent, and most of them are ill prepared to help because it is so specialized, and and those nuances really matter. So one led to another, which led to another, and after spending a tremendous amount of time, more time than I probably care to admit to, I became a subject matter expert in that area, is specifically the insurance aspect of it. Not so much the operations, but because of the conversations I have on a regular basis with clients, I started seeing patterns, and not just clients though, but what I would call a prospect, somebody who's interested in either going into the space or re-entry into the space.
Okay.
That's
Okay.
yeah.
So I wanna ask you something that I've heard to be true, and I don't know if it is. That there's essentially only four companies doing non-emergency insurance. Is that true?
So what we're referring to is the insurance carriers. Of course, there's a lot of agencies out there. There's a
Right.
lot of agents throughout the country. But depending on the state, like for example, Michigan, Michigan has more or less one, arguably two, and maybe even arguably three in certain situations. But yeah, it's dominated by a few players. The reason why there used to be more, but the losses, commercial auto, generally speaking, in the United States has been a losing proposition for a lot of insurance carriers. A lot of them have had, their faces just smashed into the sidewalk, just their heads handed to them basically, and they just kept withdrawing. One after another would withdraw. And so, right, you can see a great example is, we'll use Progressive. Pretty much everybody has heard of Progressive. And Progressive, for a while, didn't write NEMT anywhere in the country. Now, I believe that they're in 3 states, maybe 4 states, and they're the largest commercial auto insurer in the country. You have other big players. To speak to your 4 would be National Indemnity, sometimes referred to as NICO. Berkshire Home State will write it. AGMT. There's also Illinois, and Prime. Although Prime, that's a situation where, like, somebody entering into the industry wouldn't consider Prime. They're not a company that you would want to go with if you were just entering. And there's probably a few other players out there that are smaller that will write it, that are just not well known, or they're not in one of the states that I'm in. I'm physically located in Wisconsin. I'm insurance licensed in about 15 states.
Okay, so would you recommend for my viewers to check with you first when they're starting? I mean, is that...
Sure. Of course, I have a strong bias, but that being said, I can say this, that I'm zero pressure, and I would welcome anybody to look at like my Google reviews, which will reflect that, or ask for referrals. I can provide referrals in lots of states, including states I don't actually work in. So if there's a state I don't work in, but somebody calls up and they have questions, I'll answer them for them if I can.
Okay.
Might not be exactly insurance related, but those questions might be related to starting a business generally, and that. I find a lot of people who reach out, they're literally just trying to get started, as opposed to those that are operating and are looking for a lower insurance rate. And I think that speaks to what you brought up, that there aren't very many players out there, and generally people are there. When you pick and this is actually really critical too, when you pick an insurance company, you may not even be able to move. A great example would be if you go with National Indemnity, the NICO. Home State, Berkshire Home State is owned by the same company as NICO. They will not compete against each other. And there's advantages to both. For example, with Home State, they do a credit check, and they do that continuously. And in the long term, your rates are almost always going to be lower over the long term. However, most insurance agents can't write Home State. You have to be qualified to write NEMT with them. And most quite frankly, most agents aren't. So all they have available is Nightco. However, if you take Nightco to begin with, you can't switch to the other carrier because they will not compete against each other. In most of the time, 99% of the time, there's always exceptions to everything pretty much, but that's a pretty hard and fast rule.
I had heard that there were like essentially four of the major carriers, and they were all owned by Warren Buffett, and they wouldn't compete with each other. And so it's just like, again, like my channel is obviously supporting the industry, and I do support it. But man, that is that's something to be concerned about. I mean, if you're looking for
It really
reasons
is.
to be concerned, I was going to tell you a story because I have not shared this story. It's not a story you would want to share, but whatever. I'm going to do it now. And the story is this: one day, I went to a trade show for our industry. It was in Las Vegas. It cost, I don't know, like $2,000 to just get inside, and it was 5 days, and it was this trade show specific for our industry, and it had everything there. I met a guy who was looking for a way out because he had a terrible accident, maybe not him personally, but one of his drivers, and he had lost insurance, and he was there looking for a way. Fast forward a year, I had a driver that, kind of a long story. He went on workers' comp. He came back, and this guy was a bad hire. We should have never hired him. He was not fit to drive. But, we are forced to bring him back. We were talking lawsuits and everything else if you're not going to bring a workers' comp guy back.
Potentially, yeah, right.
And he killed himself. I don't know what happened, but he was, we didn't have him working with patients, but we had him running errands for us, and he was in my van, and he had health problems. And when I say he killed himself, I don't know if he had if he had a heart attack. I don't know what happened in the vehicle. All I know is that he was in my van. He died. He caused an accident where my insurance carrier paid out $250,000. And that is ultimately the reason I shut down my business. It was a foreshadowing situation. I had met that guy, and, I felt bad for him, but I gave no thought about what if that happens to me. And this happened in February. And my insurance company said, relax, Christopher, at the end of the year, we'll figure something else out. At the end of the year, of course, that insurance carrier dropped me. I did have another insurance pick me up, and my insurance, I want to say it went from $4,000 a month to like $9,000 a month. There's just not that much profit in doing this. And, and frankly, I had other problems and I was beat up. I had decided to sell my company, and I had this doctor and his wife that were going to buy it, and they were connected within the city, and it was they were going to keep me on board, and everything was perfect. They could not get insurance. They could not escape my dirt. They could not, it didn't matter that it was a new company. I mean, at the end of the day, they were stuck with the same $9,000 premium for, however many vans it was. I mean, and I guess my question to you is, for the next guy, something like that happens, do you have an idea? Do you have a game plan? What do you do?
Well, right. And, to circle back a little bit, just to touch on, whether people should reach out to me, let me really emphasize this, because I'm going to add to your story here. It is vital. I mean, if there's one decision you make, you need to surround yourself. If you're going into the non-emergency medical transportation business, really any business, but particularly this one, because there is such a wide variety of knowledge, you have to surround yourself with people who understand the industry. And for insurance agents in particular, because it is such a large cost component to operate, and if you don't have it, it'll shut your lights off, as you've experienced, and unfortunately a lot of people experience. So let me just say, if there was one takeaway that I would want, that I always try to leave with people, and that is, make sure you don't have to explain anything to your insurance agent. They're explaining things to you, because if they're not knowledgeable, there's a lot of pitfalls. In my video, actually, then going to your point, I touch on this too. Hiring people in your growth trajectory are so important. And what I mean by that is, don't do it. Do not be aggressive. Don't hire people unless you vetted them very carefully. And not only vetted them very carefully, but you don't want to grow on too fast of a trajectory, because, and this surprises all sorts of people. Matter of fact, I would say most of the people I talk to on the phone, when I explain this aspect, they're really surprised. If you grow too fast and you have no accidents, you still might not get renewed. So if you go, for example, you start out with it's a one-man, one-lady band to start out with, which is how most start out with. And then at that end of that year, you have 8 or 9 drivers. They can't drop you, generally speaking, if there's no accidents or claims, and you're really not on the radar. But 10 months in, 11 months in, when they're looking at that account to see if they want to renew it, and they watch you go from 1 to 10, you might be thinking, oh, well, I was paying, just for rough numbers here, I was paying $10,000 or $12,000 a year when I started. Now I'm paying 80 or 90. They must love me now. It isn't that way. It isn't that way at all. It's the exact opposite. When you're new, insurance carriers are incredibly nervous. And if you grow too fast, there's a very big chance you're just simply not going to get renewed. And if you have an insurance agent who doesn't understand that and doesn't direct you regarding that issue, and all they see is the dollar signs of commission, then you might find yourself with a very could be successful business after 1 year of work, and now you have to find a new insurance carrier. And if there's 1, 2, 3, 4, well, if there's one, that's a real problem. But if you're with National Indemnity and you want to go to Home State or vice versa, you're not going to have that opportunity. So if you have 4, what do you really have? You have maybe 2 or 3 choices, and presumably the choice you went to begin with was the lowest cost option. So, by definition, then you're looking at a higher cost option. That, and then my phone rings probably about 50% of the time for non-emergency medical transportation from business owners that have been non-renewed or flat out canceled. The number one reason is a driver got into an accident. And it doesn't have the appearance of being one-off. It has the appearance of management isn't tight enough with the hiring. That is the number one reason why my phone rings with non-renewal. The second is probably they grew too fast, something along those lines, for people who are in business. And then, of course, those that haven't and they're looking to enter the space, my number one advice, and it's rarely taken, I think it's good advice though, is work for somebody else at first. Learn from the inside, learn while you're being paid. As a serial entrepreneur, those words are like, nobody wants to hear that. You gearing up to go into business, and if you're not familiar with the industry, there's so many different landmines you can step on. So, or in the alternative, if you refuse to work for somebody else at first, and you don't have experience in the industry, find somebody like yourself. And I'm not trying to turn this into a sales pitch for you, but find somebody who can mentor you, whether it's another operator, a mentor, somebody that doesn't have a bias like a direct competitor, but somebody who can help you along the way. Because whatever you pay them, if they know what they're doing, and some do and some don't. But if they know what they're doing, that, you're looking at an investment that might pay off 3, 4, 10 times the amount that you pay. Plus, what's a good night's sleep worth too?
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
I want to know if you may not be able to answer this, but I don't understand why in our industry. Let me back up. So, say trucking, over the road trucking, you could have a you could have a company that has, a fleet of 100 vans, 100 trucks, and
Mhm.
half of them are owner operators, half of them are company. Same
Yes.
thing in the taxi company. There's, the company taxis, and then, but you could, as a driver, you could have, 5 taxis on with this cab company. That doesn't seem to be a thing within non-emergency transportation, and I don't understand why.
So I see both. Some of it is state specific. Like for example, California. California, I know fairly well because that's where I'm licensed for law as well. But the real question here is involved. Well, all right, let's break it down to what exactly you just said. What we're talking about is being what's called leased on. You have the company that has the authority, and that is the authority granted by the federal government to transport goods for others for hire, and then they lease on others that go underneath that authority. NEMT, and those drivers can pick whatever loads, and they can work with whatever brokers they want. Sometimes, it's all under that umbrella, but oftentimes those drivers, those independent drivers that are being leased on, they find their own loads in that. So it really is truly a bona fide independent contractor type of relationship, a 1099 versus an employer-employee relationship. Now some things are true for both though. If you hire, and the growth trajectory too is very true with for hire trucking. If you grow too fast, insurance companies get very skittish. They're worried about your risk mitigation, and that you'll hire anybody. But it's easier to have a 1099 relationship versus a W-2 relationship because of the nature of it. Where NEMT, those drivers typically will they'll get their orders from the company, from the actual company itself, and then the company is doing what's called, they're directing those drivers too much, and it becomes too hard to justify a 1099 relationship, contractor and independent contractor relationship, compared to an employer-employee relationship. So that's why you don't see it as much. In California, it's really rare. But it does exist there too, and sometimes it's just not, it doesn't catch the radar of the state. But in other states that are not so opposed to that type of relationship, you do see it a little bit more. But so when you're deciding if, and I have a lot of clients that start out, they want to hire people as 1099 contractors, and then I go through the whole thing. And I've got a few articles on my website that addresses this. Is this person a contractor or an employee? The starting point is they're an employer-employee relationship. That is the starting position of every state I'm aware of and the IRS. So you have two things, and sometimes they're different. The IRS can say, yep, we're okay with it being an employer-employee relationship, no problem. And then the state can say, now, it's the opposite. And then that can make taxes actually really confusing, because you can treat them one way federally and the other way the state. But both parties, the IRS wants to collect as much Social Security as they can, and the states usually want to collect unemployment insurance as much as they can, and withholding. It's easier to collect those taxes if it's an employee-employer relationship. Plus, the state or the states have an interest in protecting these workers, so if they get hurt, workers' comp kicks in as well, if it's an employee-employer relationship. So there's a lot of, including by the insurance industry too, of course. I'm kind of neutral on that. I'm not a real big fan of workers' comp, generally speaking. But the insurance industry, of course, wants to see as many people roped into that corral as possible because then they sell more.
But at the end of the
When I
day,
say me too, I guess. But yeah.
at the end of the day, you know non-emergency companies that are doing that.
Yes, I give advice. Like I said, I'm zero pressure, so I don't think it's my role to tell people what to do. I give them the information, I give my advice, and I say, given what you've told me, I think you have an employee-employer relationship. Now, what would you like to do? And some of them will tell me, we're going to run them as 1099s. And we're going to either take a chance for I don't agree with you, or, I read something online that says I can do it this way, or if we agree to it. And that is a real misconception for sure. Just because that driver or that worker, we can call them a worker because the fact that they're driving doesn't necessarily matter. But that worker and the boss, the owner, if you will, both of these parties can agree we're 1099 relationship. Everybody's happy. That's how they want to do it. And that has no relevance or such a low, is such a low relevance that it might as well just be, you might as well not even consider what the agreement is, if you will.
People come to me all the time that they want to start.
Mm-hmm.
And they're excited to start.
Yep.
And I always think like, if somebody else has already done the work for you, but you want to buy your own van and lease on with them, I think that's a great solution because companies are desperate for drivers. I'm going to come work for you with my own van. I'm going to be responsible for it. It just, I've never heard of it. I've never heard of it. And I always thought it was such a shame that this industry doesn't seem to embrace a situation where like I can buy my own van and lease on with you and be under your authority that the same as in trucking.
I would advise, so let's say somebody came to me and they said, hey, I want to start this business, and I don't have to imagine it. This actually happens on a fairly regular basis. And then I'm going to hire 1099 people. And the next question then I ask is, who's going to own the van? Now, if that leased on person is buying the van, that bodes very well that is a 1099 relationship. And the reason why is one of the criteria, and there's 8 main ones, but there's about 14 in total to 20, depending on how you define it. But if that person can actually lose money, that's a big chip in the favor of that it is a contractor type of relationship. Then the next thing is, do they set their own hours? If they can set their own hours, again, that pushes it towards that way. And then if they're finding their own fares, or if they can charge what they want often, which isn't usually the case, but that doesn't have to be that. That's a smaller one. And then if they can hire people underneath them. Now, if you could say yes to those things, that person has hiring decision to hire people underneath them, they have their own insurance, because that would be another aspect. In this particular case, it would be like they'd have their own general liability, because the leased on, they can go on the commercial auto, generally speaking. So it can work, but it has to be managed, and it has to be a scenario that works well, because you have the IRS, and then you also have the question of brokers. Some brokers don't play well with that.
Yeah, that's probably the big death nail. So,
right, but if you're doing private pay, if you're not using brokers, and maybe you're working with clinics and in nursing homes, and so it just, it really does depend on where that income is coming from, and also where that person is getting their fares. So maybe you do have somebody working, maybe have both. You can, there's no reason why you can't actually have both. You can have some employees, and maybe they're doing the broker business, and then maybe you have subcontractors that are doing, they're finding their own fares, or not necessarily fares, but they're finding their own contracts that they're going to work through you. So it can be done. I have clients that do that sort of thing. But again, it has to be managed, and you want to do it. This is, the real important thing here, that you want to do it if you want to stay in business and grow your business and build wealth and have a company someday you can sell or pass on or whatever. It's really important to do things the right way. I say this often. I'm a Boy Scout. I try to treat people the way they want to be treated, and I put a lot of faith that my success comes from that attitude, where don't cut corners, don't worry about today so much, worry more about tomorrow. The same goes with that. Also, I didn't fully answer your question about the different parts of the country. I realized that. To touch on that, insurance, unlike most things in the country, is very state specific. Like, for example, I mentioned I'm licensed in about 15 states. I cannot, like a driver's license, I can't just operate in, because I have one state license, I can't operate in any state I want. I have to be licensed in every state that I want to do business in. Usually that's pretty fast. I'm qualified to get licensed in every state in the country, and it's more of a matter of just giving them money. But every state has their own rules. Like, for example, some states have no fault accident, personal insurance protection. It's often called no fault or PIP. And some states do not. Some states have unlimited amount of medical expenses. For example, Michigan, which also has the highest rates in the country. Wisconsin, which is literally, they touch each other up in the Upper Peninsula and separated by a large pond. Wisconsin doesn't have PIP, doesn't have that, no fault, and has very loose insurance rules, making Wisconsin literally like number 2 or number 3 cheapest in the country. Next door, you have literally the most expensive. So, and it's not close. We're not talking 20, 30%. We're talking often double, 70, 80% more to insure the exact same activity in the UP as it would be 20 miles away. And so that kind of distorts the market too. There's a lot of businesses that are literally right on the border of Wisconsin and Michigan that they probably should be Michigan companies.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, we had agreed to go 30 minutes, and then when we get done with this, I'm going to be interviewed on Bob's channel, and I'm very excited because I've never been interviewed. But we've gone
It'll be a lot of fun.
Little over 30 minutes. I want you to let our viewers know how to get in touch with you. You mentioned you have a website. How can they find you?
Yes, thank you. So onereason.com, the numeral 1, REASON.com. And my phone number is 715-598-9924.
Awesome. Well, you know what? It's been fascinating, and we'll be back next time. In the meantime, I'm going to pause this, and we're going to run over to Bob's channel. So until next time, drive fast and take chances.